Hey guys, it's M. And today I wanted to talk about something a little bit different. It's been a minute since I uploaded here and I'm trying to get back into the swing of things, and I wanted to hit another smaller topic before I got into all of these. That's how you can tell when I initially wrote this script it wasn't this long. Zombie Army 4. A game I fell in love with literally out of nowhere. I'm not even really that sure how I ended up playing it. It might have been free on PS Plus or something once, and with a name like Zombie Army, one of the most generic titles imaginable, I wasn't expecting much. But then I started playing it, and before I knew it, I'd finished the campaign like 5 or something times and cleared Nightmare on every mission I owned. I don't think I've ever straight fallen in love with a game like this since Monster Hunter Generations, and that was in like 2016. So today, I'd love to share one of the greatest and underappreciated zombie games in existence with you. Zombie Army looks fucking amazing. I mean, just look at the background of this video. Huge set pieces, lighting coming pretty much off of everything, pretty polished and clean animations. I'm shocked this isn't one of those games that make my PS4 sound like it's about to go off the runway. It's hard for me to overly expand on this point because I feel like it speaks for itself visually, and it keeps this kind of visual consistency the entire way through. If I had to lowball, this campaign is about 12 hours long, and you'll be sent to 10 very different locations, each of which breaking off into 3 or 4 different segments in the same area, and I love pretty much all of them. Every time I replay it, I'm always surprised by how much variety they managed to cover with these. From fighting across an infected train station, going across Venice in a boat, to literally hell frozen over. It really cements the feeling that your journey is spanning across the entire world. And in each of these locations, there's always fun things to find and see. Unnecessary small things that sometimes don't even give you a completion bonus, but give the game this feeling of love and charm from the developer. Something you don't tend to feel too often nowadays. I'll touch more on this point later, but replaying a good chunk of this game for this video, I was surprised by how many little Easter eggs and quirky things were just casually hidden in the background, and some things I had never even seen before. The story here is absolutely ridiculous, and the game knows it. It's functionally a vessel for you to do cool things. In short, you're fighting zombies again. But unlike COD Zombies, which tries to take itself pretty seriously with the most batshit things happening in the background, Zombie Army, as I said, knows it's ridiculous, and I feel that helped it do whatever it wanted. Hell, the final cutscene consists of a zombie resurrected trying to hit you with magic while your character smashes their face in with a glorified brick. And as goofy as that sounds, and inherently is, it feels fucking awesome. As while the action and situations happening tend to be really silly, the animators didn't hold back because of that fact. The characters don't ever stop and sit down for a cup of tea with the zombies or anything like that. They handle these things as if it's a life or death situation. This is how we get scenes like the zombie shark escape, seeing the destroyed remnants of Rome after your final battle, getting sucked into a portal and waking up in hell itself. And trust me, those are some of the lighter examples in the grand scheme of things. Alongside all this, all of these cutscenes have different variations depending on how many people you're playing with. Again, another example of this game putting a lot of unnecessary but appreciated care into itself. The characters here for the most part are your cheesy action heroes, being serious most of the time but saying cheesy one-liners in the middle of combat. I can't really say I dislike any of them. They all have their own unique charm that they bring. I don't think they're as unique or lovable as the Left 4 Dead crew or anything, but they do have that same kind of vibe to them. Definitely above the World War Z or Back 4 Blood cardboard cutouts of survivors. If there were any in particular I wanted to bring attention to, I want to bring up Werner, Karl, and Hector. Werner is a German soldier who is obviously against the Nazis and who joins the crew. He's the wimpiest sounding of the group, but not in the way where he whines 24/7 and is just being annoying. Simply in combat, he's not as stoic or jokey as many of the other characters. He sounds kinda scared and like he's putting his all into the fight. He was a character that I got after beating the game, and I didn't expect to like him, but he definitely grew on me the more I played as him. Karl is our walking generic badass American hero trope who sells the cheesiness of this game. He's a deep-voiced one-lining machine who doesn't really seem fazed by anything going on, as he has this I'll handle it type attitude throughout the entire game. It's hard to not like him if you like that trope, because he practically embodies it. Then we get to Hector, who's hands down my favorite character, and I don't mean just in this game, maybe in anything. He's a British zombie pilot who joined the Resistance, and he's hands down the funniest and goofiest character here. I really love him. He's super nice to pretty much everyone he interacts with, though he's got a little bit of sass to him. Like Carl, he never really seems super fazed by everything going on, but it's not because of a stoic badass attitude or anything. He's just like that. He never curses or raises his voice at anyone. He's just sort of dealing with what's happening in his own quirky way as if it's like a mild inconvenience. And it's funny to see that contrast of him normally talking to people with him brutally slaying zombies, with his one-liners and callouts still having that casual Hector charm to them. He's just the best. And to touch on my story and cutscene point I made before, every single character here has voice lines going throughout the entire story and even the DLC. This even includes the characters that were added post-game launch, which is really amazing. Whenever you decide to replay the story while all the voice lines tend to lead to the same point, it gives you something new to hear. And if you're in co-op, it won't just be the host of the game's characters talking. The characters will bounce around speaking roles, making it really feel like they're this unit of zombie killer friends. Somewhat still on that point, the characters even have unique callouts for one another that you'll never hear unless you're playing with others. I fucking love it so much. It's why while I don't hold the other characters in super high regard, I wouldn't be surprised if something weird they say in the story or in one of their callouts would make me like them too. So the game looks good, and the story, while not serious or deep, is pretty enjoyable because of the spectacle. So the gameplay has to be ass, right? It's a pretty standard third-person shooter control-wise, but in standard Zombie Army fashion, they throw some extra dramatic things onto it. First, takedowns. Pretty much your insta-kill on most things. They all look great. They're all punchy and they never really get old. Let alone, there's a whole lot of them. Varying from the melee weapons and guns you choose, where you initiate the takedown from, and they even have unique finishers for each type of special zombie. I don't want to use the word as it's really corny, but it just makes you feel like a badass when you're cutting through the hordes of the dead. They also give you an entire ammo clip back, so they're helpful to do often. Then we have focus mode, which is pretty much your lock-in ability. In single player, it slows down time and makes you reload faster, making it really clutch when things get hairy. In multiplayer, it simply speeds up your reload speed, and while this does make it a bit worse than the single player variant, it's still very helpful to have. Empty lung is pretty much the same thing, but for snipers. It helps you land your shots a bit easier, and even gives you a small indicator of exactly where your shots are gonna land. Overt kill is your special sniper ability onto focus. It slows down time like both of the previous I mentioned, but it gives you a super powerful shot with no bullet drop off, which can sometimes even insta-kill special enemies. The pistol gets the brainbuster, which lets you lock onto 3 targets and immediately headshot them. This is probably one of the weakest abilities in my personal opinion, but it can definitely help you out in some tense situations. Then we have the special melee attacks, which vary depending on what you choose on the start of the mission. Pretty much any of them will help you get out of a pinch if basic zombies are close to you, and they can stun most special enemies. Then we have the Stomp, which is probably the most finicky mechanic in the game. Stomping can be used to kill enemies on the ground like in Dead Space, but it also helps knock ammo or medkits out of certain enemies. It's pretty straightforward, and the only reason it's weird to use because of the way it targets things seems flat out bad sometimes, as there will be occasions where your character will stomp and completely miss whatever you're trying to step on. It's a bit upsetting, but you won't be doing this too often in tense scenarios, so it's not that bad. All of this makes it so while the gameplay for the most part is your fairly standard third-person shooter, these mechanics help punch it up into something that feels special and you can't really get anywhere else. While all the other things I mentioned definitely help, I feel the basic moment-to-moment gameplay is one of the stronger aspects to keep people hooked. The enemies. My next 3 points will kind of all intertwine with each other. Your basic enemies here are, well, zombies. Slow and easy to deal with zombies that only become a problem if they're in a horde. Then we have 2 other basic types, like armored zombies, which are just bigger zombies in armor. You focus the spots that aren't armored and they drop pretty fast. Pretty standard, all things considered. And then we get to the crawlers, which are relatively fast, low health enemies that are low to the ground, making them a bit harder to spot when dealing with all the other enemies around. Overall, these 3 are really easy and will make the game feel like a cakewalk until we reach the special zombies, which if you've played this game, I feel are pretty iconic. Suiciders are, well, what you'd imagine. Zombies with bombs strapped on their chest that run at you to blow up, screaming at you while they do. If anyone's completed this game or dabbled around in its endgame content, I guarantee you that scream is etched into your brain. We then reach gunners, flamers, and butchers. Heavy zombies that will probably be your first clue that this isn't your standard zombie shooter, as while most variants of the undead are just mutations or something like that, these zombies are practically just hulking humans. I've clumped these 3 together because they all fit into the heavy guy with helmet category, and you deal with all of them similarly. You want to knock their helmets off and headshot them, or you want to cause them to kneel and do a takedown. While this does sound simple, All of their weapons can kill you very fast if they catch you in an awkward position, leading to them usually being some of the most tense encounters in the game. When you're fresh to playing this, they feel nigh impossible to deal with as their bodies take tons of damage and their helmets cause most of the shots to just bounce off. But once you've played it enough, you'll be able to mow through them. And it's not just due to your damage being generally higher, but because you've gained more understanding of them. They all have extremely accurate hitboxes on their helmets, meaning if you can hit them in the small openings like their eyes or mouth, you can kill them fairly easy and efficiently. When I was at my peak with this game, I was able to kill the flamers just by shooting them directly in their eye. But anyways, enough gushing about them, let's move on to the others. Necromancers, commanders, and suicide generals are next, and like the last clump, these are pretty human-like, even shooting at you with their pistols. But their main abilities revolve around buffing the horde. The suicide generals try to spawn suiciders on top of you, the commander causes nearby zombies to sprint at you at full speed, and the necromancer revives nearby basic undead. They also have this little fun quirk of not dying unless you shoot them in the heart or stomp on them. They're usually who you'll want to target first in the crowds of undead because they can lead to things getting out of hand really fast. Then we get to the zombie sniper and rocket sniper. Pretty self-explanatory, to be honest. They'll get to high ground you usually can't reach and take pot shots at you. This pretty much forces you to use your own sniper to deal with them. But if you think they'll just sit there and let you fire at them, think again, as they'll frequently jump from building to building if they aren't doing anything or want to get a better position. Pretty simple enemies, but can be pretty annoying and deadly if you don't handle them. Ending our common special enemies, we get to the grenadier. They throw grenades at you and have huge shields covering their front. Like the snipers, they're pretty simple too, and if you have a takedown, you can just insta-kill them from any time or position, making them one of the easiest specials to deal with. Then finally, we have the most special zombies in the game, and honestly some of my favorites. Zombie tanks. Yes, zombie tanks. My least favorite of the final three, but still pretty cool to go against. There are a few variants of them, but they all consist of you shooting their sides until a plate breaks and you see the tank's heart. Yes, this game revels in its ridiculousness, like I said. I used to hate these enemies, but they're used sparingly enough that they are a pretty fun way to break up what you get normally used to. Shadow demons are probably my favorite designed enemies here, and maybe even my favorite mechanically as they're such an active threat. They let out little shadow hands that crawl across the ground, and should you get grabbed, they teleport you directly to the demon, to which they then scream and take a huge chunk of your health, and possibly putting you in an awful position to recover from, as they'll usually warp you somewhere swarmed by zombies. You deal with them by shooting their heart or stomping on them like the commander types, but catching them is interesting. If they aren't attacking you when you're close, they'll warp away. If you shoot the shadow hands crawling across the ground, they'll warp away. So how do you catch them? You usually have to wait until they begin their shadow hand attack. Then you have to maneuver over to them while avoiding the hordes and their hands to initiate a takedown. Or you could go for the quick sniper heart kill while they're at a distance and just summoning their hands. Though this is more difficult than it sounds, as they turn to their sides when they're looking at you when attacking, which was a really interesting design choice that I didn't even notice when I was first playing. So while simple to deal with in concept, dealing with everything else in whichever encounter you're doing with them on top can lead to your absolute worst nightmare if you're fighting them wrong or don't really know how to deal with them. At the beginning of the game, they felt downright impossible for me and caused so many of my deaths. But by the end, while I still get grabbed every once in a while, I pretty much never get downed by them. But this all leads into our final special enemy, the blind screamer. Seemingly the dev's favorite, as they're the first thing you see on the home menu screen. These are pretty much the biggest threats you run into during the game, and they have an ass load of health. They are the fastest zombies in the game and are able to down you the fastest out of any special due to their insane close range damage, alongside a scream that will stun you unless you're in the middle of performing certain actions. But the trick is, they're blind. In the base game, you're not forced to fight any of them, as if you sneak past them while crouching, they won't attack you. If you're forced to fight them, which as we'll get to eventually you may have to, they're not devoid of weaknesses. They have a weak spot on their back that takes increased damage, but this is probably the finickiest mechanic to them because after a certain point it feels like it just stops working. It's a bit buggy honestly, and I wouldn't rely on that alone to kill them off. If you're not in a forced combat encounter or an arena, running a good distance from them and crouching may cause them to lose aggro on you, letting you either slip away or leave them so far from you, you can handle the nearby threats. Things that make a lot of noise like explosives can draw them away from you, and when you get the incinerate grenade or mine upgraded, you'll have a guaranteed way to get free shots off on them due to that making constant noises. Then there's my fastest and favorite method, takedowns. Unlike the gunner, butcher, or flamer which you need to force to kneel, you can always take down this enemy if you have one prepared, but you'll have to get behind them to activate it. And seeing if you have a takedown you're most likely already in a combat encounter, this forces you in a situation where you have to run up to the thing that could straight up maul you and force it to flinch so you can jump on its back and stab it to death. It's one of those things that always feels cool to do and it never really gets old to me, especially because you're always aware if you slip up, it's practically an instant death. All of these special enemies really spice up the gameplay, as they all cause you to switch up your battle plan and think about how you're going to handle the situation. Zombie Army isn't that hard of a game. On normal, despite all I've said, it's a pretty casual romp through all these locations. No matter what guns you use or what level you're at, it tends to be pretty easy. It has some more difficult stretches here and there, but it never really goes past standard third-person shooter fare to me. The higher difficulties are basically artificial difficulty boosts, as they bump up the enemy damage and health alongside making sniper shots harder to perform. Probably my least favorite way to increase difficulty, to be honest. When I play zombie games like this, I tend to like how they test your ability to be able to deal with hordes of enemies they throw at you. Not when they simply throw a bunch of meat shields at you and call it a night. However, this game does do something interesting. Alongside the difficulty, they have a player preset slider. This game will spawn the amount of enemies appropriate for how many players you're with. Meaning when you're with the boys, the game doesn't just get simply easier, as the game compensates by spawning more special or regular enemies at you. If you're feeling like a badass, you can set it on 4 players by yourself and fight what feels like the entire zombie population alone. Or if you're really crazy, you can set it on 4 players and on Brutal, which I'm not even sure is humanly possible. It's nice to have this many ways to customize how you want your experience to go, but honestly, none of them really work for me. 4-man single player is cool, but it doesn't often feel more difficult, it just feels like you're fighting the same guys for longer. And as I said earlier, I don't like the scale difficulty because it feels artificial. Base game is fun for the first 1 or 2 times, but then you notice how much easier the game gets when you level up, special enemies become a joke and you learn how to deal with them, alongside the fact that special enemies are criminally underused for the most part. The screamers, for example, are only used 2 or so times in the entire base game. So while it's cool you have all these mechanics to kill all these zombies, it's just overkill at a point, as you're extremely strong and the enemies feel like wet tissue paper. If only there were some other mode to handle this issue. Nightmare mode is hands down my favorite piece of endgame content here, and probably my favorite way to play the game. Nightmare mode changes which and how many enemies spawn on every single encounter. So enemies' health doesn't change, but the enemies you're fighting do. The zoo, for instance, goes from 1 optional screamer encounter to forcing you to fight 3 of them in the first part of the level. The first level goes from a cakewalk where you don't run into any special enemies until the final section, to an extremely brutal level where you're fighting multiple butchers, flamers, and gunners. If I had to compare it to anything, imagine the master levels from Doom Eternal, but instead of it only being done for 3 or 4 levels, it's applied to the entire game. It forces so many tense situations that the base game flat out didn't have. It's amazing. All of the knowledge that you picked up over the course of the game that made it feel trivial before feels damn near needed to survive here due to the waves and waves of special zombies. The ones that were heavily underused, like the Screamer and Shadow Demon, appear pretty often here. For instance, in a base playthrough, if everything's going right, with these super special enemies, you might have killed 1 of them. But on Nightmare, by the time you finish, you've probably killed at least 40 or so of them each. Some of which, considering how strong they are, is no small task. I can only really remember 2 encounters with the Shadow Demons in the base game, but they become a pretty standard special to run into here. It pushes the game to its absolute limits of what feels fair and possible, and I love it. I remember at first I thought it was downright impossible to beat, but now I've beat every single level, including the DLCs the devs gave away for free on Nightmare, by myself. It's just awesome for anyone seeking a real challenge. And I'm pretty sure this mode alone extended my playtime by damn near triple. Now, does it have some flaws? Yeah. Sometimes I've had encounters bug out and refuse to end. The zoo is a great example, as if you don't run past a certain point before triggering the horde, the mission simply won't continue. Some of the enemy placements in the DLC areas are a bit crazy even for this mode. Schweiger's boss fight immediately comes to mind, as it doesn't really feel like there's much of a strategic way to handle it, so it comes down to a lot of RNG, deaths, and training the enemies for what feels like forever, at least on single player mode. But I feel those few moments don't weigh down the entire mode for me. The endgame here consists of a few things. There's Nightmare, higher difficulties, and the Horde mode. But there's also a lot of collectibles you can find in the main story. Zombie hands, comic pages, documents, and upgrade kits. It's very unlikely you will have gotten all of these in your first playthrough, so they give you an excuse to play it a second time. And these even serve a practical use if you aren't a completionist, as everything besides the upgrade kits will unlock and upgrade certain perks you can get, while the upgrade kits themselves help strengthen your base game weapons. Moving on to the builds here, they're pretty fun to mess around with. Every character has their own strengths and weaknesses here, but you can give them certain perks to help them boost certain attributes. Things like faster health recovery, higher damage on certain special moves and grenades, lower kill requirements for takedowns or focus. Your perks will help along your builds and let you focus more on your favorite aspects of the combat. Like for me, other than Hector being my favorite character personality wise, he takes less damage from melee attacks and requires 1 less kill for takedowns. So I made a build that helps me do that more often. Polishing your build to your liking alongside all the other things available means there's a fair bit of content to go through here. Zombie Army is a game with a lot of charm and character, which I think is why I love it so much. It feels like something a bunch of people with too much talent, free time, and a really big budget put together. And I mean that in the best way possible. It's why despite me owning COD Zombies Killing Floor and games like that, this one trumps all of the others in playtime for me, as I always come back to it again and again randomly, and it never disappoints me. I always catch some new detail or understand some aspect a little bit better, and it feels great. The charm never gets old for me. It's got a lot more heart than many of those other competitors, which will either add a fraction of the content for the same price, or just feel like mindless drivel after being played for long enough. And to top it all off, this game even has fucking crossplay. If it's not obvious, I really want you guys to check out this game. I'm sure many people noticed it was made by the Sniper Elite guys, then wrote it off as a cash grab and ignored it. But that couldn't be any further from the case. If you like third-person shooters, cheesy action, or just zombie games in general, I can't imagine you wouldn't love this game. It's criminally overlooked, all things considered. The devs even handed out the first DLC clump for free, alongside Left 4 Dead skins for a majority of the cast. Just because they could, I guess. But I don't want to gush on and on in this section about how much I love it and feel it's underrated. So I should probably end things here, as I could most likely double the script's length with just rambling if I did that. So with that, I've been M, and I am out.